Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and safe in this difficult time. And wishing everyone happy Eid al-Adha. This is Ankita Gaur, co-organizer and head of Judiciary Preparation Cell of MyLawman. We welcome you all in the inaugural ceremony of Online International Summer School on World Trade Organization and International Trade Law. I request all the participants to kindly mute your microphones during the session and please your doubts or queries in the chat box. Now I'll introduce MyLawman in brief. MyLawman is one of the fastest growing legal community websites for legal resource sharing and an e-learning platform for law students, legal professionals, and legal academia. As a one-stop solution, MyLawman caters to differential needs of law students, professors across various divisions like legal blogs, opportunities, journals, judiciary preparation, and e-learning content, including research training courses. MyLawman is a growing family of around 250 law students as volunteers, interns, and campus ambassadors, along with hundreds of law faculties on board. In today's Rajan Sudesh Ratna as guest of honor and Dr. Srividhya Ragavan as keynote speaker. Now I will introduce our organizing team, Ms. Sonal Saxena, Ms. Dhaval Srivastava, Mr. Abhinav K. Mishra, and myself, and also Ms. Dharma Sahitwani as the moderator. Now I am handing the platform to Ms. Sonal. The stage is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ankita, and good evening, everyone. This is Sonal Saxena, co-organizer for this International Summer School and head of Research and Innovation Division of MyLawman. As 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of WTO, MyLawman brings to you International Summer School on WTO and International Trade Law to learn about the development of WTO during these 25 years. The creation of WTO marks the biggest reform of international trade since after the Second World War and established a global framework for nations in liberalizing trade in goods and services, protecting intellectual property rights, and easing trade tensions. The WTO now accounts for 98% of the world trade with 164 members. If the last 25 years have taught us anything about WTO, it is that this organization is resilient and resourceful. The summer school shall cover 25 lectures along with one special session spanning during the next 1 month. You will be addressed by over 20 distinguished speakers from various nations. The guest of honor for today's inaugural session is Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna, and our keynote speaker is Dr. Srividhya Ragavan. I would now call upon Mr. Abhinav Mishra, organizer of the summer school and founder of MyLawman, to introduce our guest of honor for today, Dr. Sudesh Ratna, sir. Over to you, Abhinav, sir.
Good evening, all of you. Happy Eid al-Adha. Greetings from India. Greetings from MyLawman, and welcome all of you. We have among us two distinguished speakers here today for the inaugural ceremony of this International Summer School on WTO and International Trade Law. As WTO completes its quarter century, a retrospective introspection seems a desideratum. Equally important is for us to assess the changing stratum of the organization at present and also to look ahead towards the future of the WTO and international trade at the international level. It could be said that during these 25 years, one can see as to how the organization is transmuting itself from the objective of free trade to a fair and balanced trade system. The prime objective of this summer school is exchanging and expanding the realm of the ideas. A true legacy built upon ideas and not on rocks. Rocks will crumble, but the ideas will stand tall. With this notion, kindly allow me to introduce Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna ji, who has a stellar reputation and a certain experience in the same field, who will inaugurate and open the summer school with his kind opening remarks for all these participants from various countries among us. Mr. Rajan S. Ratna is Economic Affairs Professor at United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, UNESCAP, South and Southwest Office at New Delhi. He was Professor, Center for WTO Studies at ESCAP. Before joining the country in 2008, he has served the government of India for more than 21 years. In government, he dealt with matters of international trade policy formulation and implementation. He belongs to Indian Trade Service, a special service cadre in the government of India dealing with matters of international trade policy formulation and implementation. He worked initially in the Directorate of Foreign Trade and later in the Ministry of Commerce in the area of international trade and economic matters. His work revolves around the areas such as agricultural negotiations in the WTO, NAMA sectoral proposals, trade in environmental goods and services, TBT and FTA proposals, India-EC FTA negotiations, trade and gender, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act implications to India. He participated in several negotiations relating to WTO, preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements, the comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, and his area has been of the rule of origin. During his tenure with the government of India, Mr. Ratna also arranged a stockholders consultation to provide input to the government of India in its negotiating strategy and policy making process, and was in charge of arranging training courses on trade policy for government officials, civil society, business personnel, and others. Dr. Ratna has done his MSc from Banaras University and MPhil from JNU. He has also done course on foreign trade policy from IISc and on negotiating strategy from Harvard University. He has written several papers and made presentations to the several issues relating to the trade policy formulation, trade policy of India, and published articles and papers for UNCTAD, UNESCAP, Commonwealth Secretariat, and some of the leading periodicals of India on the issues dealing with regional trade agreements, preferential rules of origin, trade liberalization, FTAs, TBT issues, etc. Now, with this, I invite Dr. Suresh Ratna ji to grace us with his opening remarks and inaugurate the summer school. To you, sir.
Thank you, Avinav. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon from New Delhi, India. I know it's a tough time for everybody. I am seeing many messages which are coming in that you cannot hear or you cannot, but this is the new era which we will have to live with and survive. The internet connectivity could be a problem. In fact, connectivity could be a problem. And that is where you see what I am going to talk about is this 25 years of WTO. It is indeed a pleasure for me to have been invited by the organizers for this session. So I must first congratulate all of you for joining this course, which is very relevant. And I must also thank the course organizers for arranging this, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Well, when we talk about 25 years of WTO, let's not forget that the foundation for the WTO was laid back in 1944. And then an institution which was known as GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, was established in January 1948. So we are talking about a multilateral trading process or an institution which is 73 years, if not 72, old. And many a times, and many of the people think or put this responsibility of the success or failure of a negotiation, or a success or failure of a trade regime, or a success or failure of a developmental objectives, whether they met or not for a particular country, on WTO. But mind it, WTO, if you see, as the word stands, the World Trade Organization, in itself means nothing. The core of WTO is membership. The core of WTO are those obligations which the member countries who were earlier member, or that time it was known as contracting parties of GATT, have obligated and taken a binding commitment on themselves as to what they would do. And they talked about bringing the trade regime more freer, more predictable, more transparent. And that is where this test should stand. If you ask me, or if you, and I am sure in the course of the day, you will go through many of the presentations. But please be mindful of a fact that whenever that has been established, and after that the WTO has been established, the trade has really been picking up. The global trade is increasing. The share of developing countries in the world trade over the last 50 years has been on rise. The transparency in the trading regime is there. And so the multifarious activities which are involved along with trade, the countries have benefited from. Trade liberalization, which was earlier thought that is not essential. You need to believe in protectionism. You need to allow your domestic industries to survive, no longer exists, because today we are talking not about the tariff barriers, but we are looking into a global supply chain where the cost of trade matters much. So if you increase more tariffs, if you make the trade more costlier, any economy cannot remain isolated. There are many reports, and let me cite some of these, which basically relate to how the global things are happening. So in 2018, when we talk about that is the year when we have the data, the average global applied tariff rate on goods comes to 9%, when it was 19% lower than what was there 2 decades ago, or more than that. And the trade volume has expanded 42 times the level, showing the growth of very high growth of around 4,000% between 1950 to 2019. The world trade also has ballooned 302 times the level of 1950s. As I was talking about, the countries liberalized textile, which was very restricted before WTO, was restricted under GATT, was opened up, and the quantitative restrictions were removed under the multi-fiber agreement, and many of the developing countries benefited because of that. The Uruguay round, which was the last round, also saw many other issues coming in, comprehensive agriculture agreement, whereby the tariffs were reduced, there were discipline on subsidies and domestic support, and so it led to many of the countries' benefits. As per the estimates of WTO, there are, of course, there are many debate which is happening on that. But they said prior to the establishment of that, the global average of tariffs for the world trade was around 40%, and now it's less than 10%. As I said, 9% is the global average. The share of developing countries in the world has increased over the years and is constantly around now touching to around 50%. So half of the world trade is happening, is taking place through the developing countries. What has also been observed during the process, that when the tariffs are going down, rise in non-tariff barriers has increased. And this is a phenomena which is happening. There are many instruments and the policy measures which have been allowed by the WTO itself in the form of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures or technical barriers to trade and providing unfair trade practices remedies through anti-dumping, countervailing, and many others. And countries have seen much more use of these instruments. As per the estimates of the WTO, together the non-tariff measures account for around more than 50,000 such measures in form of SPS and TP. So while we have seen the tariffs going down, the world has also seen that the non-tariff barriers have gone up. And so are the number of disputes in the WTO. Now, it is highly debatable whether the disputes or the trade disputes reflect good or reflect bad position of a trade agreement. But before I go into those numbers, everything is not very rosy in terms of the WTO. I'm sure in subsequent classes it would be there, but the basic principle of WTO lies on four premises. Two of them are non-discrimination. One is very popularly known as the most favored nation treatment. The another is the national treatment. I won't touch upon in greater detail on them, but I will just naming them for you. It also says in terms of goods, the trade is to be regulated by the custom duty, in services through the domestic regulations, and for them, you will have to take the binding commitments. So the countries undertake binding commitments in the WTO on various agreements which have entered into place. The devil lies in detail, because for each one of these basic principles which are there in the WTO rules have allowed exceptions to them. So when it talks about a non-discrimination among the countries in terms of the trade policies under the MFN, we have seen more than 500 regional trading agreements which have been notified to the WTO, where countries are giving preferences in trade policy to select group of countries. And I'm not saying this is allowed within the WTO. So at one principle you have the MFN, but the another principle or the rule you allow an exception to it. Similarly, there are many plurilateral agreements within the membership of the WTO, where these agreements allow only among the limited number of membership. The current round where the negotiations are going on also has several proposals, where they are thinking that if there is no consensus in the WTO on the entire membership, they would be looking into the option of going for a The other thing is, we talked about trade liberalization, we talked about transparency, we talked about predictability. But after the global economic recession, which started in 2008, there are many countries which took the measures which were called protectionist. Not that all of them were violative of the WTO basic obligations. They were allowed by the WTO, but they were to a certain extent protectionist measures. But the fact remains that without WTO, post 2008, we would have seen much number of protectionist measures. Another worry which is causing to everybody in the present world was the attitude of US. In fact, the GATT, which came out in 1947, started with the Bretton Woods when we talked about 1944, was pushed by none other but US. It was US which was pushing for a multilateral trade agreement. And in last couple of years, one has seen US taking a U-turn in its position on multilateral trade policy. One such example is the US-China trade war, where US has discriminatorily used trade policy measures of imposing tariff barriers on China, India, Korea, and many other countries, including EU, leading to a total number of 596 disputes in the WTO, on which 350 rulings have already come. Now, there are two arguments one can make. Disputes are indicators that the WTO or the multilateral trade rule is effective and functioning. Because if trade rules were not sacrosanct, the disputes would not have arisen. The countries have faith in the dispute, and that is why they are going to the WTO as an institution, seeking the remedy, and therefore it can be used as a successful parameter of WTO doing a good job. Now, when you evaluate, when you try to balance for 25 years, one needs to be conscious that whenever such trade agreements are made, they are not the most perfect trade agreement. The language, the text is negotiated, and therefore the countries look into the least imperfect situation, not the best. It's the least imperfect situation, and therefore there are many loopholes in the agreement. Some are intentional, some are that they will be settled later, and some are because the negotiators could not foresee that this sentence could be interpreted like that. Many benefits have come out because of the WTO. Trade has become more transparent and predictable. Countries have generally shown adhering to their commitments. So far in the history of GATT and WTO, so I'm talking about 72 plus years, there is not a single decision in the WTO which has not been taken without a consensus. Building a consensus of present 164 members is a daunting task. Despite that, in 2013, countries showed their commitment, and they had a Bali Agreement and the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which came into existence, shows that the countries believe in the multilateral trade system, which is its strength. LDCs have benefited. There are many schemes, many things for them. Duty-free, quota-free scheme for them, which is a unilateral tariff preferences on goods. Services waiver in terms of giving a preferential market access on services goods. The flexibility in TRIPS, trade in intellectual property rights. Many other special and differential treatments which has been provided in the agreement. through the developing countries and the developed countries have benefited. Even the say or the strength of developing countries in deciding the outcome of negotiation has increased. Before Uruguay round, developing countries did not have much strength, did not have much clout, didn't have much knowledge. But these 25 years have brought many of the developing countries to really transform themselves into a good negotiating country. So each country here in the WTO 164, all of them have a vote, one single vote. The another thing of the multilateral is emergence of China. You will note as the course will progress, China was member of the original signatory in 1947-48 when that was established. Then the communism government came and China withdrew, and they again later on in 2000 got into the WTO. And that has really transformed Chinese economy after it has acceded into the WTO. We have seen the formulation of the global value chains, and as I said, the protectionist measures taken in the 2008, post-2008 have also not been so much as one could have anticipated. Another important issue which we need to keep or take note of are certain pitfalls. The agreements were agreed. Countries agreed for many of the textual proposals, but some of them did not see the order of the day. So in agriculture, the market access in the Uruguay round was anticipated that developing countries will gain. But because of the domestic support and the subsidies which allows more money to be pumped in by the developed countries, even the farm gate prices of many of the developing countries have been much higher, but because of the subsidization, they have not been able to capture the global market. Non-tariff measures have been on rise, it has not been controlled. There is a lot of debate which is going on special and differential treatment for the developing countries, looking into some kind of a graduation or scaling them into different categories. What was agreed in Doha as a special and differential treatment agreement or implementation issues at that moment of time, not much progress has happened. In fact, now negotiators say that the Doha round is almost dead. So when the countries have negotiated for almost 17, 18 years, and then all that has gone into the waste. Whatever we may say, the green room process is still there, is still powerful. So few countries could still play around with it. New ways, innovative ways of protectionism is coming, which one has seen US imposing tariffs on China and other countries under the security exception. There are many new issues which have been opened. The dispute settlement mechanism, what is happening in e-commerce, the fisheries subsidies, investment facilitation, domestic regulation in services which are on board. So many of these are being negotiated. But there are many other issues which are relevant, but the countries have not realized. We have seen, we all are doing all this while remotely where we are, thanks to COVID. Many of you would have read World as a Globalized Village. Now, if you really want to see world as a globalized village, the simplest of the cases which can prove that world is one single village is the novel coronavirus. Starting from one country, no country in the world is untouched by this and it spread so fast. We are all dependent on each other, but what we saw, instead of cooperation, we saw borders being closed, we saw export restrictions imposed, we saw except essential commodities, everything is stopped, labor loss, employment was lost. Many of the developing countries which were there, where the labor workforce was in the informal sector, they have a lot of problems. But not that WTO is responsible for it. But we need to learn lesson. And why I'm saying is that in WTO at one point of time, there was a working group, there is still on paper, working group on trade and transfer of technology, trade, debt and finance. But over the years, the work did not progress well. Today, when every country is trying to bring in or develop vaccine for COVID, perhaps such kind of transfer of technology experiences sharing, allowing the technologies to be transferred could have perhaps made the world much better than what it is now. Unfortunately, even the present stalemate in the WTO, some of you would have known Roberto Azevedo has quit from the WTO DG. He will be leaving this content. And they have to appoint by the end of this year a new DG. They were looking for an interim DG. And 3 days ago, US again blocked it, stating therein that it wants even the acting DG as a US candidate. So if you believe in multilateralism, the unipolarness of the trade regime will make it very, very difficult. WTO also allows mandate, the decisions to be taken by majority. It's not that it has to be always consensus, but the countries are waiting for consensus shows their commitment that they do not want to take desperate measures, because that will be really weakening the WTO. Unfortunately, as of now, I may be wrong, it doesn't appear that there is any plan B. The preamble of the WTO talks something, I will not read it, it's a long paragraph, but he talks about how the the trade and economic measures should be used to raising the standard of living, ensuring employment and growing volume of real income. It was, interestingly, I was looking at a report which was done by Peter Sutherland in 2004, where he suggested, and I'm just reading one sentence, the WTO is about providing opportunities. It does not provide guarantees, nor does it provide all the conditions for participation in the global economy. Of a book, I am picking up only one sentence, so don't get misguided. But the context has evolved, it has changed. DG Azevedo on 1st January 2015, when the WTO reached 20 years with statement, and he said he was very happy that the trade has and how WTO has led to not too much rise in protectionism and other things. And again, in his message at WTO on its 25 years, he says, despite these considerable achievements, it is no assurance to say that the WTO faces challenges today. It is no exaggeration to say that the WTO faces challenges today that are unmatched in our relatively short history. Over the past 2 years, governments have introduced trade restrictions covering a substantial amount of international trade, affecting $747 billion in global imports in the past year alone. That is where we stand today. That is what reflects of 25 years of WTO. Unfortunately, in his own statement of these 25 years, there is not a single sentence about Doha developmental agenda. So that leaves us at this crossroad, where WTO has reached at a crossroad of 25 years, but members are divided. They do not know where they need to go, perhaps. or they know where to go, but there are different directions in which the countries want to go. And the other big issue which is very important for the WTO to understand, or the members, they are looking between equity and equality. And that is where it stands today. Thank you very much.
So much, sir, for such a deep, practical, and analytical insights on WTO politics and multilateral trade practice. It was really amazing to listen to you on these points. Allow me to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Srividhya Ragavan. Dr. Srividhya Ragavan is a professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law. Ragavan joined Texas A&M School of Law in 2016 from University of Oklahoma College of Law. Dr. Ragavan is an expert in intellectual property law, patents and trademark law, international trade law, and biotechnology and pharmaceuticals law. Dr. Ragavan's scholarship focuses on the interplay between international trade law and intellectual property issues with developmental perspective. Her work emphasizes issues that affect developing nations from embracing the trade regime. Her publications have expounded diverse topics like traditional knowledge, pharmaceutical patents, and agricultural subsidies. Her work, both research as well as research, particularly focuses on India. In her celebrated book, Patents and Trade Disparities in Developing Countries, this book was published by Oxford University Press in 2012 and has been republished in the South Asian market. Her work on access to medication and global public health has been featured with several conferences and her work has been particularly recognition in India. Dr. Ragavan had previously served as a consultant for Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Government of India. Dr. Ragavan has served as a Fulbright Nehru Scholar and as a Fulbright Specialist in South Asia region. He is a SJD from George Washington University and an LLM from King's College, University of London. He did a graduation from SSIU Bangalore and has also served as a visiting faculty with the NASA University's IT Pro program and authored of course modules that are still being used by the students at NASA. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ragavan for her keynote address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sonal. It's a great privilege to speak after Dr. Rajan Ratna. And it's a great privilege to be invited to be the speaker in this forum. I do want to say that I found the earlier presentation very informative, it covered the depth of the topic, and I was grateful to have the opportunity to speak right after that. The topic that I will be talking about is called WTO before, during, and after COVID. So COVID in some ways, resets the WTO. So I want to begin with the WTO before COVID. Dr. Rajan Ratna had talked about how GATT, the historical perspective from, the genesis of the WTO from GATT. And what I want to start with is, how the distinguishing features of the WTO from GATT, rather. Right. So to me, the WTO represents what I call as an uncomfortable marriage between trade and intellectual property rights. Right. I always call it to my students. I always call it it's an uncomfortable arranged marriage between trade and intellectual property rights. And to this date, both parties have not readjusted well to the presence of intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights, the philosophy behind introducing intellectual property rights is a very interesting phenomenon, right? When the WTO, with the genesis, part of the reason why the WTO included intellectual property rights was with the idea that the West had knowledge capital. So in a lot of ways, innovation was flourishing in the West, and West was the hub of innovation. And the rest of the world was the market, not only for the innovation, but also for the byproducts of the innovation. So the idea was we create and then we sell it to you, and over a period of time, you will learn to accommodate and you will learn to be like us, so to speak, right? And so trade in intellectual property was important from these aspects, because much of what the West had to so to speak, to give to the rest of the world was bound by patents and trademarks and copyrights and all forms of intellectual property, and therefore it was important that there was no barriers to accessing, those intellectual property rights. Part of the bargain, and which the previous speaker also talked about, was that developing countries and the least developed countries would embrace intellectual property rights, and in turn, the rest of the world, that is the developed countries, would in turn free the barriers in agricultural trade. So that was the agreement, so to speak, or the contract of the system, that the richer nations would free the trade barriers in agriculture, while the more sort of poorer nations would embrace intellectual property rights and therefore free the barriers for trade in intellectual property rights. Why was agriculture more important? Obviously, the poorer nations were rich in agriculture. Agricultural trade was more important for them. But however, this trade was not happening well because of subsidies and other barriers to trade. So in simple layman terms, to grow a bag of rice in India may cost only, let's say 500 rupees, which is very high price in reality. But let's say the cost of production is 500 rupees. But in the US, the cost of production for the same bag of rice would be about $20, right? So much more than 500 rupees. Yet, the U.S. government provides subsidies to U.S. farmers, right? And therefore, those subsidies would cover $19.5. So any time a farmer in the U.S. Cultivates a bag of rice, he gets $19.5 from the government. So ultimately, when you go to the world market, to the commodities market, the Indian farmer wants to sell at 600 rupees, while the U.S. farmer can afford to sell at 400 rupees or the equivalent of that, because his government takes the risk of the loss, or the subsidies sets them on equal footing. So if the subsidies were reduced, if agricultural trade was liberalized, that would help both developing, but most especially the least developed countries. So that was the bargain between agriculture and IP rights. Unfortunately, the poorer countries embraced IP rights far quickly. The agricultural negotiations stalled, partly because of the conflicting needs of nations. But as we look at the WTO and into its future, that is an important step for countries like India. So before COVID, what made, the previous speaker also talked about it, so is the WTO defunct? Has it been an organization that's useless? Absolutely not. The WTO has contributed to development, globalization, and to achieving some of the preambular objectives of the agreement. And the WTO has also, I don't want to say suffered, but has also felt the impact of some of the byproducts of the trade regime, which it was not ready for at the time of signing. Such a byproduct is what I call as talent capital, right? When the WTO was signed, the entire idea was the knowledge would flow from the developed countries and into the developing countries, right? One of the things that surprised the developed countries is the talent capital that's fueled from countries like China, India, Eastern European countries, right, which surprised the trade regime, something that they were not ready for, right? The Sundar Pichai, was not contemplated at the time of WTO. The Satya Nadellas were not contemplated. Not even the Indian software engineers or the law professors that they're talking about were contemplated. And of course, I'm talking more about the Indian examples, but Chinese, African, Eastern European, many talent capitals flowed into developed countries and contributed to the innovation, thus really contributing to globalization. But that left a new realization for the developed countries. For the first time, developed countries realized free trade ain't free. It's not free. It means competition. It means competition for jobs from unknown quarters of the world, from India, from China, from Poland, and from other countries. And that's why we see election results being skewed in the United States. So for the first time, the United States now, and this again the previous speaker talked about, is now embracing protectionism. So suddenly they're like, oh, we don't want these foreigners. We don't want their innovation, because they're suddenly realizing that free trade ain't free. It means, in some ways, competition from all quarters of the world. The talent capital made a difference not only by going into, not only because of immigration, but also because of local development that we have seen in obscure parts of the world. China being the best example, of course. India, not closely behind, but certainly India is also a great example, and also several other countries in the world. Brazil, South Africa, all of these come to mind. Right? Now, how did all of this shape the WTO? We have to think about the WTO before COVID. Obviously, we talked about the poorer countries implementing the IP regime, right? But the trade regime was also important for many other things. Right? Globalization also meant, to some extent, access to products that we did not have access for. I mean, I am in India today. I see that I can practically get everything that I get in the U.S. in India. If anything, some of these things are available far more easily in India than it is in the U.S. Right? So globalization, the Apple phones, the Samsung phones, your Nike shoes, your New Balance shoes, all of it today. Once it used to be a hard-to-access item, now it's an easier-to-access item. Right? But the most important aspect of it is what I call as maturing of the poorer nations. Right? When they were first, and it really, I mean, I love the concept of arranged marriage, right? So initially when these nations were introduced into the trade regime, they were shy participants. They were not confident participants. Right? Over a period of 5 years, we have seen countries like India, Thailand, Brazil, South Africa becoming mature, informed, confident participants of the trade regime. The huge disputes, Thailand, several compulsory licensing of drugs, Novartis, Bayer, Roche supply disputes in India, Brazil's universal access to AIDS medication. These are all great examples of poorer nations. And of course, I'm taking examples from pharmaceuticals, from biotech, in particular, because of my background and also because of the importance of that background with COVID. But these countries have become more sort of informed and engaged participants of the trade regime in a way that was not contemplated. The idea was that these countries will become informed participants after maybe several years, maybe after 15, 20 years, but these countries answered the call far more quickly than was contemplated. Right? But that did not in any way, I mean, all of these are positive things. However, the WTO before COVID was a very normative organization. When we call, what I call as normative, is an organization that looked at norms. It had a strict constructionist approach rather than a realist approach. So in legal theory, we talk about a normative versus a more sort of realist approach. The WTO had what we call as a normative, norm-based approach. The best example was India's mailbox dispute, right, where we talked about accepting some of the patent applications, India accepting patent applications before 2005, from 1995 to 2005, as part of a mailbox mechanism and saving them. right? The only thing I want to highlight is, even though the Indian government said that the ordinance that was issued by the President of India was considered legal under its laws, at that time the WTO said, no way, we need a transition mechanism because that's what Article 70.8 and 70.9 of the say. So very normative, very strict constructionist approach, right? In a lot of ways, the WTO also sustained the bargaining parities of its members. What do we mean by the bargaining parities of members? The powerful members, so to speak, money speaks everywhere, money speaks even in world trade. So you see that the more powerful nations like the United States, the coalition of European Union and Japan have continued to be stronger parties with much more muscle in the WTO, right? And is that reflected in the WTO? Absolutely yes. You know, it's reflected. For example, Special 301 to 310, that's the name of the dispute on whether the United States is imposing unilateral pressure on countries using the office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, which, of course, every year comes out with a Special 301 report. If you watch the newspaper, you will actually see that Special 301 report come in every, January, February. That's the time the report comes in. The report is presented to the Congress, and then the Congress slowly accepts. That's when Robert Leitner this year, and every year the USTR plans a trip to India, because they want to say, look, you have to increase pharmaceutical patents, and of course we treat them exceptionally well, and then they give us a small concessions and go back with much bigger concessions, right? So the question in that dispute was whether, in some ways, countries like U.S. and European Union are exerting unilateral pressures on poorer countries. Right? Of course, the EU has its own mechanism to exert pressure. In this dispute, based on an administrator's promise, basically the USTR promised that they will not put certain countries or they will not impose trade sanctions based on the Special 301, and therefore they will not get the priority foreign country status. The WTO said, well, we understand as long as you don't do it, it won't be considered unilateral pressure, right? But I don't think if it had been India or Russia or another country that does or did what USTR does, I don't think they would have been extended the same privilege. But the most important aspect of the WTO before COVID was this. It is that trade was considered superior to even public health. So trade was the central hero of that team. Anything that affected global trade was, immediately the WTO would step in and basically say that, no, trade is being affected and therefore we are not going to support it. Right? So trade was the, so to speak, the hero of the entire WTO. There are several examples of this, right? But I want to rephrase what I said, which is trade dictated public health by anyone. Any effort at all to protect public health by any of its member states was considered a barrier to trade. And because it was considered a barrier to trade, the WTO would come in and weigh in heavily, provided there was a multilateral dispute. Understand that we've talked a little bit about unilateral pressure as well. The WTO works on the idea of multilateral dispute settlement. So that's how you have the dispute settlement body, which of course again now has its own problems because the appellate body has had one member, we have to fill one member of the appellate body at a very sort of critical time, and there has been an issue there as well, just like the DG leaving, the Director General of the WTO resigning. However, pre-COVID, I want to highlight that trade dictated in a lot of ways. Trade was considered, public health was considered subservient to trade. Examples, of course, was the AIDS crisis. People were dying in South Africa. A percentage of the population in South Africa died. The SARS, the Ebola virus, sorry. Sorry, obviously AIDS, HIV crisis, all of these are moments where the WTO did not happen as quickly as it should have, nor did the WTO exert its influence in a way that protected public health. By the time the Doha Declaration was passed, that was because of pressure from countries, effectively from India, Srividhya comes to mind, but also of course other countries like Brazil and South Africa joined India, which was great, right? And the anthrax crisis, which represented 200 Americans, having an issue, of course. I always say this in my class, right? 200 American lives were considered equal to thousands of South African lives at that time. Of course, the COVID crisis has changed that altogether, changed that statistic altogether. So that resulted in the Doha Declaration. The Doha Declaration, as the previous speaker also mentioned, an absolutely important milestone of the WTO for poorer countries, right? For developing as well as least developed countries. However, right, I don't think any of these countries have exerted the power of the Doha Declaration as well as they should have. There was a lot of opportunity. COVID, of course, presents the biggest opportunity to exert the power that one sees in the Doha Declaration and Article 31B of TRIPS, for all countries, but especially the developing and least developed countries. And yet, I don't think this has been exerted, and this needs to be exerted. Especially, again, in pharmaceuticals. Right? The Doha Declaration made, basically gave member countries the flexibility to say that public health becomes important, right? And it came at a time when a big pharma, essentially, and even now too, big pharma has what we call a self-destructive prices, right? I mean, I am in India now, and I was just looking through some of the prices, right? Some of the drugs that used for, certain forms of cancer cost close to 16 or 18 lakhs of rupees, right, per month supply of these drugs. And that's true especially with some of the more sort of lung cancer, some of the Bayer drugs. All of these drugs have been priced out of reach of most people, of course affecting, public health, right? So the picture of WTO pre-COVID is a system that was uniquely focused on trade and innovation. It did result in globalization. There were a lot of advantages. The biggest disadvantage, of course, was that when it came to public health, it was unfortunately dysfunctional. When it came to intellectual property rights, it was collusive. I don't want to use the word corrupt, but the power, the unilateral pressure that was imposed in some ways made the system unchecked. And it gave way to a lot of unchecked greed, is what I want to say. The consequence of all of that is, of course, the UN report, the UN report on access to medication, the Lancet report, the WHO report on hepatitis C, the WIPO Global Development Agenda. All of these reports essentially highlighting the need for increase in public health, the need for improving public health and healthcare, and how intellectual property rights, particularly patents, is a barrier to robust public health. So this is exactly, of course, that also meant that patents lost a bit of its steam. When WTO was, when WTO was signed in 1992, right, the most glamorous area was patents. Right, so patents represented the most important area. Patents represented innovation, trade, and FDI, and all of that kind of stuff, key stuff, right? But at the end of 25 years, patents have become a business tool. A lot of times, economists have highlighted that it does not represent the kind of robust innovation that was originally thought, that we thought it originally would. So that's where the WTO stands. And then COVID happened, right? So how did the WTO do in COVID times? And to me, the WTO struggled. The WTO struggled as the WHO suddenly, for years, the WIPO and both WIPO and WHO have tried to work with the WTO. Especially the WHO has been trying to say, look, some of your policies are a barrier to trade. There's a huge WHO report that talks about how the WTO policies are how the TRIPS agreement. Of course, it talks about the psychosanitary provisions as well, and then the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement as well. But essentially focuses on TRIPS and patents and highlights how some of these measures are a barrier to public health. And suddenly, the spotlight was on the WHO, right? The side hero who did not expect to become such a big hero in such a short time. And the WTO has struggled from an identity crisis, right? So with that, the biggest game changer was a realization that public health absolutely dictates trade, right? As trade stopped in countries as airlines stopped, as trade stopped, as goods could not come from one country to another country because of the COVID crisis, as people stopped working in manufacturing, in meat plants and other facilities, came the realization that somewhere it's public health, right, that's more important than trade. In fact, public health can contribute to trade, but not the other way around. That's a realization I think the WTO continues to struggle with. And the new WTO has to absolutely address this realization, right? In order for the WTO to thrive in the post-COVID world, I believe that it has to absolutely confront some of the barriers in healthcare. It has to absolutely confront some of the barriers to public health. It has to absolutely confront how it has left the Doha Declaration without teeth and give it more teeth. Obviously, much of that is with the member states, and I believe that many member states are already realizing it. The biggest member states, of course, are Canada. Starts with Canada, but Brazil. Brazil, of course, has been on the fence because of its leader. Chile, Ecuador, some of these countries, Costa Rica, some of these countries have come up with proposals to have a global coalition of companies to work together to find a solution for the virus and to also find for the testing, for the treatment, for the distribution, and for tackling the virus in due time. Obviously, other countries that have taken a lead here, Costa Rica, of course, wanted a WHO-led coalition. Israel wanted compulsory licensing, and so did the United Kingdom, which is a huge step for the United Kingdom to come back and say that they would prefer to compulsorily license some of the COVID-related testing and medication. The United Kingdom also, one of the biggest steps in allowing the Oxford University to work with serum vaccines of India and AstraZeneca. So this is a fantastic coalition, right? A university, a developed country, and a generic drug company. I mean, this would be a dream team, in the pre-COVID world, and a slightly more difficult to think setup. But COVID naturally gave rise to that setup, and thus we have this coalition. We have open science partnerships. Ecuador, Chile, Canada, and Germany wants to compulsorily license. There have been public-private partnerships in terms of medicines patent pool, which now has become more robust. It was started before the COVID crisis, of course, because of Jamie Love, but now it's much more robust under the WHO, and it's also collecting data and information. So all of this has made it much more important to tackle the public health aspects of WTO. We have also seen several global pledges to have coalitions and to help generic drug companies to work with some of the innovators. But what is missing is the biggest piece of the puzzle, which is the U.S. The U.S. has been missing in action. The U.S. has been missing in action in several fronts, not only in controlling the in controlling the virus, also in taking steps proactively. And now, of course, there are several vaccines being tested in the U.S., but also in other parts of the world. So U.S. is no more the leader in that sphere. It's one of the leaders, but certainly not a leader. Right? One of the biggest game changers has been university partnerships, something again hopefully will make a big difference to public health and to the provisions relating to public health at some point in the WTO. Right? So where does that leave us during the COVID crisis for the WTO? It is absolutely changing the contours of the healthcare industry. This is an industry that has to change, and it probably would change rapidly in the post-COVID world. I just saw a question that asked about wasn't USA slow to react to the situation? Absolutely, and that's what I was saying. The U.S. And that's from Sanya Man. I think absolutely, USA has been very slow to react to the crisis, very slow to test, very slow to accept the test, very slow to create its own test, and now some of the vaccines that it's trying to produce, it's given $2 billion to Pfizer and to Moderna, and a couple of the Emory University came with some hydrochloroquine products. All of that is going through phase 3 of clinical trials, but really not really doing well. Other missteps of the U.S., since you've asked that question, in March, when there were 80,000 cases in the United States, at that time, it was just becoming a big crisis. At that time, the FDA went ahead and gave remdesivir the orphan drug status, right? So, and it did that without, basically orphan drug status would give them more market exclusivity for a period of 7 years. All of this, of course, made it much more privileged. Of course, several of the NGOs objected to it and the state was removed, right? And all of that has set the U.S. back by several notches. The lack of proper healthcare has been an election issue in the U.S. for over 8 years now, past 2 elections. The lack of proper healthcare and so on and so forth has been a big issue, setting the U.S. back, right? So that leaves us with the question of what happens to the WTO in the post-COVID world. Mridula has asked the question, didn't Gilead take back the orphan drug status? Yes, because of a lot of protests. Absolutely. Gilead has taken back it's not Gilead, FDA withdrew the orphan drug status. Typically, I want to highlight it now, orphan drug status is given only, basically is given to drugs that was protected using patents, that finishes its data exclusivity, its regulatory exclusivity, and its patent monopoly. And then we find that that drug is useful for some rare diseases, right? And so at that point in time, an orphan drug status is given. The orphan drug status gives that drug exclusivity in the market to treat that rare disease for 7 years. So it allows that company to price it at a higher price. Gilead was planning to price it at $3,000, I believe, in the U.S. and about $1,000 in the rest of the world for a month's supply. But because of some of these things, the NGOs protested, and the orphan drug status had to be withdrawn. Right? Would you say cross-licensing and so on and so forth? There should be no boundaries. These are some questions we can deal with once we are done with the presentation. I just thought some of these tasks are really useful, and so I addressed them. We'll deal with some of these questions after the presentation. So now I want to look at what has happened post the COVID situation. Absolutely, I believe healthcare and public health situation should change. I also believe that the WTO should learn to work with other international organizations. The question naturally would be, does it work with other international organizations now? Yes. Typically, WIPO files, when there is a dispute, WIPO, it has also in several cases, both I believe a couple of cases WHO, but several cases WIPO has filed an amicus brief. Amicus brief is friend of the court brief. They have filed these briefs. The WHO, the dispute settlement body may or may not take these into consideration. In several cases, we don't know if they have taken it into consideration, but really they've not given it enough deference. Again, if all of this is clear, if the new DG should take place, the appellate body should become functional, all of that happens, which I'm pretty sure will happen at some point in time, the WTO should learn to work with other international organizations, including WHO, WIPO, UN, and other important international organizations. The TRIPS flexibility should take precedence. We have not used the Doha Declaration at all. The TRIPS flexibility should take much more precedence. Obviously, Article 31B, which allows importation, should now be worked. And there is a need for global coalition, especially in pharmaceutical patents, and that needs to be worked. Right? When we talk about the pandemic, particularly, it's not only about the vaccine. It's about testing. It's about the vaccine. It's about pricing. It's about regulatory exclusivity. It's about patents. And it's about administrative issues such as march and ride, role of universities, public-private funding, OTA, transactional agreements, which basically allows a funding body such as NIH to get around and add more IP rights. All of these are issues that countries should tackle at different levels. Obviously, NIH is a very sort of U.S. issue, but each country will have its own issues, and each country should tackle these issues. Operationally, supply chain, distribution, refrigeration, transportation, these are all operational issues for which we'll have business managers who will work with some of the other countries, and there has to be a coalition here too. Right? What would be the scope of government involvement as we see now? And as I already said, countries like India, UK, Canada, and some of the other countries, Germany, France, these are all countries that are doing several things. Israel, these are all doing several things to create global coalitions, to work with these coalitions, and most importantly, to create the flexibilities in the legal as well as the policy space. These things have to be established, implemented, and the WTO will be required to, at some point, to acknowledge the role of public health if it has not already. So with that, IP rhetoric should be consistent with national health goals. That is something we have not seen with the WTO at all. An acknowledgement that intellectual property rhetoric, when it comes to pharmaceutical patents, these have to be consistent with the national health goals. Otherwise, it affects national productivity, and in the same way, global productivity in the long term is something that we have not seen as an acknowledgement from the WTO. Hopefully, that should be something that we should look at. So with that, thank you for the time, and thank you for letting me speak. And I give the floor back, the virtual floor back to the organizer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Of course, these tough times of the COVID-19 pandemic are the interesting times where we strive to achieve the new things and for a better and sustainable future with the cooperation. And yours indeed was an informative and helpful speech, ma'am. As it was mentioned earlier also, that the prime objective of this course is to change and expand the relevance of the ideas. And you, of course, provided that approach of the balance from objective of free trade to balanced trade, a system of trade which acts on consensus amongst the members which believe in the sustainable development process, aiming at enhancing the natural resources. Ma'am, your speech lies the careful observation and understanding to implement the same. Now, although it is the occasion of the inauguration of the federal school, But going with our academic activity and with the permission of the guests of today, I would like to ask certain questions which have been asked by the participants, ma'am. So there's a question from Sanya Ma'am, I guess. What do you suggest, ma'am, about the change in the relationship between the nations when the vaccine is going to come in the market, in accordance to their friendship and their bonding at international level?
What's the question? Please read it. I'm trying to get to the question, but I'm not able to. What do you suggest? Sorry?
Yeah. What do you suggest about the change in the relationship between the nations when the vaccine is going to come to the market?
That's a wonderful question. We do expect a lot of change, and I mean, countries should learn now to work with each other. So countries like India, right, which is now producing through serum vaccines, 1 billion doses of vaccine, will be using SIP 31B flexibility to import to other countries, including developed countries, to some parts of Europe. I don't know if the US will allow it, but certainly to some parts of Europe, but definitely to the rest of the world, right, to other Asian as well as African countries, right? So the distribution channels, there has to be some sort of coalition in all of this and collaboration in all of this. And of course, between European Union, we see that there is a lot of coalition and collaboration already, and that's going to happen more. It will change the trading landscape to some extent, but some of it will also depend on the November elections in the United States. The United States could become a great coalition partner. The United States probably will not. Much of it would depend on the election too. But certainly for the rest of the world, I'm a little more collaboration because of the vaccine than before.
Thank you, ma'am. I guess that this question again would go to you, that from Arpita Sinha, and she asked that now when it has been realized that the public health plays a major role, shouldn't WTO embrace sanctions in the system as well as for acting against the idea, especially in the pandemic, along with the recognition?
Should WTO or WHO? I didn't get that.
Shouldn't WTO? It was about WTO embrace sanctions in the system relating to the health and public at large, in the idea, especially in the pandemic time.
And sanctions for what? I'm not sure I got that. I don't WTO, sorry?
Like the question says that the public health plays a major role. So keeping in mind the public health frame, shouldn't WTO embrace sanctions in the system?
So I don't think the WTO, yes. So sanctions are WTO does not have the authority to impose sanctions unless it's part of a dispute. I don't, in the middle of a pandemic, countries are trying to go for consultation or for setting up a panel, because some of it has been act of God, right, or act of virus, so to speak. But B, also because it's hard now to really blame any other country for some of their mishaps. Every country has done its own set of mishaps, except a small country like New Zealand, I suppose, right? So I don't know if the WTO has the right to suo moto impose sanctions. I don't think so. And so that may be a more difficult thing to envisage.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. So there is another question from Kathy, and she asked that you commented that trade used to dictate health. How were the exceptions to GATT and GATT, even SPS agreements, with regard to health interpreted? I remember reading about like she says again, she further says that I remember reading about disputes like asbestos dispute, biotech dispute, which talked about relationship between health and trade, international trade.
True. So they did form an exception, but actually if you look at the asbestos dispute, in the first round, France lost, right? They tried not to, they basically said we don't want our asbestos to be imported, and the WTO did not agree. So much of it has been consistent with the idea that there should not be a trade barrier, right? Exceptional health conditions, health situations, the WTO has been open to considering it, but the consistent philosophy is that trade barriers affect global trade, and global trade takes precedence to everything else, right? Doha, of course, was a clear exception. I think a much bigger exception than some of these other agreements as well, because that was because of the millions of people we lost due to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I really think much of it is because of the role of the NGOs, right? So those were exceptional circumstances, but trade was the dictating principle before. Sorry.
Thank you. And now I will take another question from Aman Taneja, which I would be open to the panel, to Dr. Sir and you, ma'am, both. It's about that, do you have insight on how telecom patents, like standards in the 5G and the newer technologies coming to the telecoms, how do you see these playing out with the increasing protectionism and the trade, international trade?
I want to let Dr. Rajan speak first.
Sir.
You can speak. No worries. I can just supplement you. That's not
Sure. Okay.
Now I will leave this to the panel to who speaks first. I guess I don't hold stimulated.
I don't want to stop your flow of thought. It's a very passionately I'm following your speech.
I enjoyed your speech too very much. So go for it, sir. I'll follow you.
Okay. See, on this issue of telecom, the dynamics to my understanding is slightly different than the normal IPR or other issues, because these are not innovations which have been made. Innovation, of course, remains with the patent holder, but these are optioned by the government. So it's a regulatory authority in a particular country which kind of keeps a tab or a control on all this. Now, where does it lead to? And that is where we can go into a more sensitive dimension of trade. One, definitely the companies, telecom companies, if one company gets it, the others will have to compete and get it. Otherwise, it will become a monopolistic situation, which is not desirable, and no government or no regulator would want that to happen in a particular country. The second issue is, nowadays we know, and this is also being debated in the WTO in the e-commerce discussion, the data is power. Big data is power. I mean, many of you would have seen, we all use mobile apps. You search for a hotel, you search for a restaurant, you search for a food. Whether next time you go on your Facebook, you open your internet browser or Google Chrome or whatever you open, there is always a pop-up which comes in, and it comes into so the artificial intelligence uses and it scrutinizes each and every consumer, what is your liking, what you are doing, what you are looking at, and 5G will be more powerful into it. So it brings the knowledge and information will bring that kind of power which will land into a money-making game. So it's a much bigger issues which are involved here rather than looking into within the trade framework. Thank you. Dr. Ragavan, you have the floor. I can't compete with you on your legal...
No, I cannot agree with you more, because unlike pharmaceuticals, telecom has the benefit of, it doesn't affect everyday life. It doesn't affect, it's really trade per se. And of course, all of the technology companies have become powerful. And big companies have learned how to use patents, especially in this area with, the planned licenses and so on. So they're, to work it very well. And each country, as you say, now has planned rules, regulations, all of these. So I don't think I completely agree with you that I don't think it will affect that warfare, so to speak, in any way. That will, if anything, now the space will be clear. That will proliferate much more. And that's a good thing. It has its negatives, of course, but that will also happen.
Yeah.
Natural course.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bose. Now I will take another question from Ranjini Puran, and she asked that if two countries enter into an agreement for not imposing taxes with regard to an agricultural crop exporting and importing, and later if the situation changes and they impose taxes, what action can be taken in the international trade?
Ms. Ragavan?
I thought I'd let you answer. I just want to say, if two countries do it, it's bilateral. I mean, and that's the biggest negative that Dr. Rajan had pointed out, right? So it becomes bilateral at that point. So whatever the bilateral treaty says, it's governed. Sir, am I right?
Yeah. See, I mean, my take is what Dr. Ragavan says is true. Please understand, I was talking about when you say two countries talking about one is duties, another is either you say export subsidy or export taxes or something. Now, within the framework of regional trading agreements, which is allowed under Article 24 of that, the duties at the borders are allowed to be brought down to zero. So that is perfectly fine. That's what Ms. Ragavan also says. It's a free trade agreement which is bilateral in nature. You make commitment between these two partners and it remains within that. When you sign a bilateral agreement or a plurilateral agreement in terms of free trade agreement or a preferential trading agreement, you cannot take a recourse to a WTO dispute into that. There has been a history where in one case the members of a free trade went into a dispute and they wanted DGWTO way back to appoint a panel, and the DGWTO refused, saying that this is not within my duty and within my purview. So it has to be solved amicably and bilaterally. The another issue relates to the agriculture export subsidy. And that is a bit catchy because so far in the regional trading agreement, whether it is a free trade agreement or a preferential trading agreement, I have not seen a country foregoing its right of not subsidizing or not supporting in agriculture because of the fact that Article 24 allows, the duties and other regulation of commerce, but I am not very sure whether the WTO jurisprudence has allowed the countries to make an exception from that if I am exporting to you, I will not apply agriculture subsidies, but if I export to somebody else, I can apply. And that kind of commitment I have not even seen in many of the RTAs which I have stand through, and precisely this is also practically not possible. When you are growing agricultural crop, you get subsidy even before you are harvesting the crop. How do you really know whether you will be exporting under that FTA, you will be exporting to that particular country, or you will be exporting to country X? So they have a lot of other practical problems related to it. So I have not seen countries committing in agriculture on discipline with subsidies or domestic support. Duty is definitely yes. That is what is FTA. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, it was helpful. So another question would be, I guess, related to the same trade war situations that we are talking about. How does WTO handle a trade war between two countries which affects more than just two nations, like I guess these two fighting nations, when it comes to the trade? Like if the Indo-China trade war is going on, then it affects the Gulf countries. So how WTO would intervene and take up this situation?
Sir, are you going to go for it?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. See, what happens in the WTO, you have to fall within the parameters of the dispute settlement mechanism which is prescribed. The first step of dispute settlement is any country which is aggrieved of an action which is taken by another WTO member, you have to notify to the WTO that this policy measure you think is inconsistent with the obligation, or if it is, that's what they say, nullification of impairment. And then you have to first step is to go for a bilateral consultation. Only when the bilateral consultations fail, then you go to the WTO dispute settlement process where you write to the DGWTO for setting up a panel. The other country most of the time rejects the request, but when you make the second time the request for the panel, it is accepted, it has to be accepted. Now what happens if a country takes a measure which is affecting 4 or 5 countries? One way is if it involves the same issue and the same articles and provisions of the WTO agreement. Then one country becomes the complainant and others join it as a third party. Please understand, dispute is very costly. One dispute by one guest involves at least $1 million spending. So if I have taken any measure against all of you, one measure against all of you, whether 100 participants want to spend 100 million, or one should spend 1 million and 99 can join as a third party. As a third party, you can observe, you can listen, you can suggest what you want to suggest, and the outcome of the dispute settlement panel will be same, whether you have 100 disputes or you have 1 dispute. So practically on one issue, countries follow this approach, and you will find India being one of them that I am really seen. Every dispute, it by default notifies to become a third party into it. Third party gives you the right to get and listen and see the proceeding. You have an access to many documents, and it is sometimes educating. You can keep a tab, you learn. So that is what countries do. It doesn't make sense for having on the same issue. Definitely on same issues, there are countries which have gone. But then what they do is they hit different provisions of the agreement.
Absolutely. And I just want to add one more sentence to it. Not only the cost, the time it takes for the settlement, right? And the panel comes out with a report, then the appellate body, and then parties have to comply. And if it doesn't comply, then it goes into arbitration and so on and so forth, which of course we've seen in disputes like apple and cotton. And that's one of the reasons countries have moved away to some extent from some of these multilateral disputes. But also makes it important for each country to think 100 times before they take it to the WTO dispute settlement body. Because you don't want to hastily take things to the dispute settlement body, knowing that it means at least another 2 or 3 years of, waiting for, when you can negotiate. If you have a good negotiator in your team, you can probably negotiate at least and get some ground in the meanwhile.
Thank you. So pragmatic answers from the panel. I'm so happy to listen both of you talking so pragmatically and practically and answering the questions. Of course, the participants would be indebted. I would take the next question, which is from the patent law perspective, actually. Ma'am, do you think a bad precedent would be set for India if India doesn't use the compulsory licensing provisions in such times of the pandemic?
That's a tough question. India has the best compulsory license judgment, so to speak, the Bayer judgment from Justice Prabhat Srividhya. But I also think that India immediately, rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, but many people would think too, in some ways it also stalled India just from a diplomatic perspective, from from going ahead with, say, from going ahead with some of the other compulsory licenses that, that were contemplated right after that. There's a political issue, then there is a legal issue. Legally, the compulsory using the compulsory license is a right under the Doha Declaration. Of course, India can use it. If they use it, they may end up facing some of the diplomatic and political consequences of the trade regime. But really, probably the better solution is to wait for countries like UK to use it. In fact, yesterday there was a report from the United Kingdom, and the report basically suggested that UK should use compulsory licensing provision. So really, it probably would make more sense for India to wait and see the rest of the world, like Israel and UK and other countries use it, and then basically say, look, you guys didn't have any other solution too. And so next time we use it, don't make such a big fuss about it. So I don't think it would be such a big deal if India didn't use the compulsory license provision in this pandemic.
Very well balanced and passionate answer, ma'am. Dr. Ratna, if you would make any comments on this.
I entirely agree, but also one needs to understand compulsory licensing is not uncontrolled. Within the TRIPS and within the WTO, it comes to you or a particular country with certain obligations and certain conditions. And those conditions you will have to fulfill. It's not that you can manufacture and you can go for a global marketing. It provides certain conditions for your local market as well as the international market to which you are going. And you have to play within those rules. So it's compulsory licensing is not another marketing tactics that you can use compulsory licensing for, doing that. So I entirely agree with Raghavan what he says. That one need to be a country need to be cautious. And in fact, India is one country which has never misused the provision of compulsory licensing. So it needs to be taken into that account.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. I guess that this will be my last question to the panel. We have received so many questions, but sorry. Today's participants. Example, India is making up the local and made in India. So how will it affect the world, the international trade? Will it affect the international trade at all?
You got cut off a little bit. Could you repeat some portions of the question, please?
Yeah, sure, ma'am. Sorry. Due to COVID-19, countries are now trying to be self-sufficient. In the terms like that India has even started this local and made in India concept. So will it affect international trade? Or as the countries are trying to manufacture their own product and rather than focusing on the import and these stuff like that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I really think November elections in the US will in some way will have an impact on it. I don't think there is, yes, all countries talk a little bit about protectionism, right? And protectionism is really not, I'm not for protectionism, but I don't think of it as such a bad word that, oh my God, you can't protect certain sectors too, right? So I think that's it's somewhere in the middle. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. So I do believe that countries will try to protect some of their industries, especially the ones that's been most affected by COVID. But that is going to be very, very minuscule. If at all, I think after COVID, countries would want to robustly trade with each other. Because the amount of economic effect each country has faced because of COVID will make it important for them to actually, have a robust trade right after that. So I don't think now in the world there is the concept of being self-sufficient is not true anymore for any country, right? I don't believe that's true in its purest sense for any country, right? So that's what I would believe. Sir, go for it.
No, I entirely agree with Ms. Ragavan. Even if you read basic fundamental economics, it doesn't teach you a country can be 100% self-sufficient. Because when you talk about endowment, when you talk about natural resources, when you talk about comparative advantage, and today you are not talking about anything out of it, you are talking about being part of a global supply chain. How can you be a part of a global supply chain being totally Atmanirbhar? Is it possible? You cannot, let's take about India. You have such a huge population which whatever you produce can be consumed in India. And 70 plus years of independence, still we have not developed a state-of-art technology. We take pride that we are software engineers and we are this and we are that. But you look at the inventions, innovations which have been made worldwide. You look at the number of IPRs which have been registered by India and the rest of the world. It will speak about your ability. I'm not pulling India down. But what I am saying is, the government's spending on research and development is minuscule. COVID, and we came out and we did an analysis of a socio-economic impact analysis of COVID on South Asia. It is very clearly brought out, and if you look at the data, in health, the government's spending is 1 to 2% of total GDP, whereas on the global average is 7 to 8%. I'm not talking about a private sector. So we are saying PPE kits, we have become Atmanirbhar. Oh, you're making masks, you're making dresses, okay. But then what happened to Rafale? What will happen to your tanks? What will happen to your armory? What will happen to the state-of-art technology which you need to bring in? That is not going to happen, and I think slightly the media has also created a hype, because Indian Prime Minister has fortunately clarified. He said, Atmanirbhar does not mean that I will produce everything in India, but we are not looking for import substitution. We are looking that his intention and the efforts are India should now start not exporting raw material and intermediate products, rather add value to it and start exporting. Well, this is good. If a country wants to go up the value chain in producing goods, why not? It will generate more of foreign reserves, but definitely India requires FDI also, because the technology can come with the flows of FDIs, and so you have Make in India and many other different schemes which were floated by the government of India. Some of them are successful, some of them are not, but it's time which will say. Honestly speaking, 100% Atmanirbharta was not there even when Mahatma Gandhi started his struggle for freedom. It was symbolic to say that you should wear khadi, you should wear suti by doing it all. But if, honestly speaking, all of us start producing what we want, in India, the farmer is not able to get his food for full year from his own production. And then we are talking about 100% Atmanirbhar. I'm sorry to say, I don't buy that.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, if you have anything to add on?
No, I'll go to the next question. But I completely agree with what was said, which is I don't think any country can become self-sufficient in the way that it is being envisaged. And it's important that there is trade and there is globalization. The only thing I want to add is with the COVID crisis, there has been other crises too, right? During this time, we have realized the gender gap. US has realized the race issue, right? So for someone like me who has one foot in one continent and another foot in another continent, I actually think now going forward we need more patents from countries like India. I mean, all of the countries from Africa. I mean, the innovation that has to come from Africa, the world is still waiting, right? I mean, I mean that's going to be a proliferation, right? Some of the things that have to come from women as a class. I mean, the gender issues that have come out during this crisis, right? So those kind of patterns as well. So the hope is that this will proliferate innovation, not necessarily patents, but certainly innovation. And the more innovation, the less self-sufficiency, I think. I don't think that will be possible. Like what sir said.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. If sir and ma'am you allow, I would like to take up one more question. This question is really nice. I'm so sorry for that. I am retracting from my earlier statement that I'm going to be taking the last. I will move last. So, how do you reconcile India's aim of being a manufacturing hub with its reluctance to join FTAs and RTAs?
So, sir, you want to take a first shot or?
No, you take. It's our last question, perhaps.
Okay. So I don't believe that a reluctance to join FTA and RTA in and itself means that India cannot become a manufacturing hub. Becoming a manufacturing hub has much to do with, local facilitation and playing within some of the trade rules which India has shown its ability to play at the right time, to challenge at the right time, and so on and so forth. So to me, India's manufacturing, becoming a manufacturing hub is really a question of harnessing its talent and to ensure that we create the right policies. And I'm really not talking about intellectual property being the only policy. I'm talking about some of the other policies that should facilitate, those kind of innovations, maybe university collaborations, maybe bi-dual act type thing for manufacturing, maybe, prioritizing in goods where we have, or services where we have a need. So it's per se reluctance to join FTAs and RTAs. I don't think in any way will hurt its status. But I know that I'm not in the majority when I say that. So I want to let Sir take on from here.
Well, I mean, you see, if I speak on this, I can speak for one full day long. Because 15 years and today 16 FTAs and PTAs of India I have negotiated all. So it's a very touchy subject for me. But let me share some of these important tidbits of these FTAs. One, when we signed an early harvest scheme with Thailand, way back in 2004, I'm talking. And we only had a list of 84 items on which we brought duties down to zero in 3 years. The whole auto component industry in India came up in arms saying that they will be dead because of these. And there are only 82, early there were 5 items. Now this FTA allowed a vending shop of Toyota to be closed in Thailand and bring the engine technology of manufacturing in India. On those 5 products, which the Indian industry was at that moment of time complaining, we got more export to Thailand and the world. Second, when we have been negotiating comprehensive agreements, including the one with SAARC, which is now SATIS, SAARC Framework Agreement in Services, and we were to negotiate market access in services. And I was internal discussion, I was talking to our bankers and Reserve Bank of India, saying that we should demand mode 3. In services, you will know, mode 3 is commercial presence through the commercial presence. And banks and insurance, etc. are under mode 3. So I was talking to them and I was saying, why we should not demand banking, insurance, etc. from the other SARC member countries? Because which country, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, have bigger the branches and capabilities than our nationalized banks and our insurance? And I'm talking about at that moment of time when we did not have these multinational brand insurance companies. But the lack of confidence in the Indian bankers and including LIC, I can tell you now, they said, no, we don't want to demand, because if they demand, we should not give. Now, if Indian banks and insurance companies like LIC, if you start fearing Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, what kind of global competitiveness, competitive advantage, giant you want to become yourself? We never demanded, we never got. Please understand, a larger economy, if enters into a free trade agreement with a smaller economy, the short-term and long-term benefit goes to both, but the short-term benefit goes to a smaller economy. Even when NAFTA happened, Mexico initially gained from the investment which came in textile and automobiles from US to Mexico. Here in India, when we followed the same model with Sri Lanka, the Indian industry was up in arms. No, hum to mar jayenge. See, that is the attitude, that if you cannot do it. Similarly, and please understand, when you are talking about prior to 2009 and 10, you are talking about Indian non-agriculture duties of 35 to 40%, 50%, 60%. Today, what is your duty? 5%? 7.5%? How much trade deflection will happen? I understand. Sensitivity in agriculture, because your agriculture duties are very high. 35%, 100%, 70%. So the circumvention of the trade can happen because the margin of preference of circumventing is very high. For 5%, who will get into this? So these are the larger issues. Today, India's utilization of FTA is not more than 14 to 16%. So of all our FTAs which we have done, we are only the third. India's FTA, most of them are presently, except a few, only on the basis of a geopolitical situation. So whether it is RCEP, whether it was ASEAN we had to negotiate because China had a 2-year advantage with us, and we felt at that moment of time that 30% of our exports to ASEAN, which was going at that moment of time, and especially in textile, which was going at that moment of time, we will be virtually locked out from that market because of the China. So it was a defensive posture in which we went in. But the FTAs with Korea, the FTAs with Japan, though political objective, but it's linked with the economic aspect because some investments have come. And the real investment has come from Korea, which is bringing in technology in India. So you see the Hyundai cars, India for the medium range car has become the global hub. So all these 1500cc below cars, they are manufacturing in India, supplying all around the world. Maruti, it was never a 100% Indian company. It was a Suzuki company which Japan invested. But that was before FTA. So I agree with, in a previous question, even now, when Mr. Ragavan said, it's not only FTA alone, but the whole, the policy of the government of India. Regional trading agreement can be a building block towards your overall objective of multilateral liberalization and becoming part of a global chain. Presently, the government is in dilemma because of the various factors, most of them are also political, and the big fear of China. So RCEP is walked out only because of China. There is an opportunity, there was an opportunity to be engaged with China, but we missed that opportunity, and today we are into that. But I really feel bad that when you negotiate an agreement, it takes you 9 years to realize that this agreement is bad for you? Who is responsible for it? Your negotiators? Your think tanks who have been advising? Or you yourself to be blamed? Was China not there when you started negotiating way back in 2009, 10, 11? For that time it was CPA, which was ASEAN plus 6. ASEAN and China never wanted ASEAN plus 6. They wanted ASEAN plus 3. China wanted ASEAN plus. It says China, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand should only have agreement with ASEAN and not the rest. We wanted, and Japan also wanted us to be in that club, because many other countries thought that India can counterbalance China in these negotiations. And today we are at a position where if we say this is not, whatever is the offering is not acceptable to me. So what your negotiators were doing for all these years? It's a big question somebody should ask. This is not a simple, straight forward answer to it, but that's the reality. Thank you.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, both. Now, this was really, really an experience insight for me. This session is so insightful that I'm sure everyone wants to continue, but the time does not allow, and therefore, I would like to thank to both of you for your time, and would like to call upon Mr. Srividhya, Head of Research and Review, for the vote of thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Abhinav sir. Before presenting the vote of the thanks, may I just tell you about tomorrow's session that is to be taken by Mr. Ankit Awasthi, who is Associate Professor of Law at Hidayatullah National Law University, Raipur, and tomorrow he will be discussing about introductory background of the CAT and WTO, and the session will start from 6 p.m. IST. So now the vote of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and privilege for me to propose the vote of thanks to our esteemed guest of honor, Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna, who has kick-started the event. It is very kind of you who've been associated with us. We are grateful to our keynote speaker, Dr. Srividhya Ragavan, for such an erudite session that participants have surely been hugely benefited with. I would also like to thank Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna again, because he has been instrumental along with Mr. Ankit Awasthi in shaping up the course, because without their help, this course would not have been possible. I also would like to thank my dear colleagues from the organizing committee, Abhinav Mishra, Kunal Saxena, Ankita Gaur, and Jharna Sahijwani for their efforts. And ultimately, I would like to thank to all of the participants for being so patient and gracing us by your presence. I would like to tell that with this summer school unfolding, over the next 1 month, you will be addressed by 20 distinguished speakers of all around the world. So buckle up yourself for this exciting journey. You won't need a visa or a mask or sanitizer or hydroxychloroquine, anything. What you would be needing is hunger for knowledge and eagerness to learn. So keep learning. Here, this is the Shankar Shivatu signing off on behalf of Team MyLawman. Over to you, Abhinav sir.
Can I just say one word? It's such a privilege to be in a panel with Dr. Rajan Ratna. So when I was very, very young, which is several years back, right, I was in a panel with Bob Armitage. He was then the legal counsel for Eli Lilly. And of course, what I am, but it's post-trip and no Doha declaration. Some of my colleagues still remember. Sri, do you remember that 20 years back? You know, Bob will never forget it, even if you don't, right? But this panel, I learned so much from you, right? I absolutely enjoyed listening to some of the things you said, and I learned so much from you, and such a privilege to be in the panel with you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Ragavan. In fact, I can reciprocate. I was listening very passionately to, honestly speaking, I can disclose this. It's a close because looking at your profile and others, I thought maybe you will not look into the developmental dimensions of it. It happens. Many of these Indians who work change their times, but I'm really privileged to see you, and I take really proud in a fellow Indian who has doing things so good despite working abroad. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for the organization.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for being with us.
So, log out. Bye. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank for your time, both of you, and all the participants. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. We will be returning back tomorrow at 6 o'clock, 6 p.m. actually, in the evening IST. Kindly join session 5 minutes before and keep yourselves muted during the session. For any questions regarding the session, you will just write down in the chat box. The questions will be taken up at the end for the question and answer session. Thank you all for your time. Thank you. So we will now just sign off from here. Thank you. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.